A tight schedule today, and we have a cutoff at 4 o'clock or in an hour's time. So I suggest that we get started here on the dot. It's 3 o'clock in Bern and in Copenhagen. In Copenhagen, where Natalia Ball and I are standing to moderate this session with you. And my name is Bjorn Gilsetter. I'm head of the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement. We are based, it's a joint center between the World Bank and UNHCR, and we are based here in Copenhagen. I know that there are a few of you participating live in Bern, and you have Domenico and Carolina there from EGRIS.
Recording in progress.
From the Joint Data Center. And why don't you, Domenico and Carolina, stand up and wave your hands around so people can see you and approach you after the session or in the days to come. So let's launch into it. We're going to do it like this. I start with a few words by way of introduction, setting the scene. Then Natalia will talk about EGRIS and introduce the first speakers. And then I will come back and introduce the remaining two speakers, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. And we have given the speakers up to 10 minutes. We've also said that they don't need to use those 10 minutes. So, but hopefully we will have some time at the end for Q&A and as interactive discussion as can be. We obviously also have the chat, and please use that. We will monitor it, colleagues will monitor that, and we will answer both in the chat and here live. So, but a few words about setting the stage. We are among a lot of statisticians here, so I want to just go through a few numbers on this particular group that we're talking about in this session. According to the latest statistics from UNHCR and from IDMC, there are some 82 million people who are currently forcibly displaced. That number has probably gone up since the report came out, unfortunately. Forcibly displaced means refugees, IDPs, asylum seekers, returnees, and stateless people. 86% of that total number are in low or income countries. 53 to 55% are displaced within their own country, i.e. internally displaced, and those who are refugees are overwhelmingly in a neighboring country. This group harbors some of the most marginalized and vulnerable people. And these people are also perhaps the most invisible statistically. Hence the title of our session. We have a decent sense of the aggregate number of people who are on the run from war, persecution, and violence, but we know very little about their socioeconomic status. What is their health status? What are their education levels? What skills do they have? What's their income? What's their wealth? What's the quality of their housing? Do they work? One of the reasons why they are in the shadows of our societies is because they're often invisibly statistically. Sometimes because they represent a too small a group to be picked up in a survey. Sometimes because they're not being surveyed at all, because these exercises are sometimes limited to citizens only. And sometimes simply because the survey does not include a question on migratory status. And there are a host of reasons why those forcibly displaced are largely statistically invisible. There are the fundamental political economy reasons, which I think we all know, but there are also capacity constraints and there are statistical technical challenges. We can change this invisibility. We can bring them into the light. And in all honesty, we should. I feel that it behooves us as an international community. At the World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, we want to create a step change in the amount of available information on those affected by forced displacement. To do so means collecting more data, but also to have better data. And that existing data is made available, it's accessible. whether that's for policymakers, for practitioners, for researchers, or others who work to make this group's lives better. Improving the quality of data includes creating better definitions, standards, and protocols, which is something we'll hear about in a second. To discuss this, I'm delighted to say that I feel that we have a top-notch panel today. We have 3 representatives from governments that host huge numbers of internally displaced and refugees or refugee-like people. We have 2 representatives from statistical offices and 1 from a central government function. And we have the director from the World Bank overseeing that institution's data work. In our session, we'll be traveling from Somalia to Ukraine to Colombia and to some extent to DC. And we have Natalia Bal from the Expert Group on Statistics on Refugees and IDPs, EGRIS, to introduce and moderate together with yours truly. So over to you, Natalia, to introduce EGRIS and the IDP challenges overall, and then I'll come back a little bit later again.
Thank you very much, Bjorn. And whilst my slides come up on the screen, also thank you for inviting me to your office so we could moderate jointly and not remotely from each other from different floors of the same building. Good afternoon, everyone in Bjorn and elsewhere that you're joining us from. I have a very short presentation that I wanted to share, really by way to contextualize the presentations that will follow from mine. Intentionally, these are very introductory remarks about the work of the expert group on refugee and IDP statistics. If you want more details and more information, please feel free to be in contact. I'm going to run through 3 main things, and thank you for moving on to the next slide. Firstly, why we needed international recommendations for refugees and for IDPs. Secondly, the key achievements of this journey so far, again, to contextualize the following speakers. And thirdly, a few highlights, whilst I have the floor, of our current work, of the group. So firstly then, before the expert group was established in 2016, there were no statistical frameworks or standards that were providing recommendations and a statistical environment, if you like, for official statistics on refugees and on IDPs. Most of the available data, and it still is the case today, that most of the available data could be classified as operational data or data that serves operational decision-making, produced largely by humanitarian partners, humanitarian agencies and organizations. This obviously, this picture paints obviously a reality where significant data gaps exist. And there was, of course, as Bjorn has already mentioned, limited visibility of this population in, for example, Agenda 2030 and the SDG indicator framework, but also elsewhere for national policy dialogue and national interventions. So a growing interest from countries is still growing to this day. And of course, a huge opportunity that the Agenda 2030 put forward with the pledge to leave no one behind. The expert group in relation to forced displacement is trying to fill that gap or contribute to that when it comes to statistics and official national statistics. The next slide, please. In that journey, and it has been quite a journey, we have a couple of key landslide milestones to highlight. First of all, of course, was the recommendations for refugee statistics. Subsequently, the recommendations for IDP statistics, the staggering of those milestones important because one obviously takes into account the former to have a coherent statistical framework for these, of course, related population groups. And then more recently, our mandate has been extended to look more at implementation issues and how we can support in terms of capacity development and other areas. Next slide, please. The work has been extremely collaborative, and I'm not going to run through the partners that I put up in the slide there for those interested in some of the details, but we have a robust steering committee that oversees a group of around 45 countries and 25 different international organizations. Why is this important? This group, this membership, is really important because it was vital from the beginning that the recommendations were not lofty and unattainable, but we're very practical. We're informed by the reality on the ground, the capacities on the ground, the very different displacement contexts in which both refugees and IDPs find themselves. So we wanted them to be, if you like, relevant for the countries affected by these situations. Next slide, please. A little dive into what's in the recommendations, again, without much detail here. We will hear, I think, from the Ukraine, for example, the importance of the focus on the statistical framework with clear definitions of key terms for both refugee and related populations and on the internal displacement side. Both sets of recommendations look at basic tabulations, they look at data sources, they look thematically at socioeconomic indicators, they look at integration, they look at durable solutions, and they look also at linkages with the SDGs. And importantly, and not to oversee, the recommendations both include a dedicated chapter on the issues around coordination, the primary focus of coordination at the national level, but also taking into account regional and international aspects of that work. So that was a whistle-stop tour through the expert group. A little focus just before I end on what the expert group is doing currently in its third phase. And this is really a focus on implementation, working with countries, working with regional institutions to get the word out there on the one hand, but also to help and support with the implementation on the other. We have three subgroups. One is focusing on dissemination and promotion of the work, another on statistical capacity building and delivery of technical support where that might be needed. And a third is looking at methodological refinements and capturing lessons learned, and hopefully one builds upon the other as that work is ongoing. We've also recently taken under our umbrella the development of recommendations on statelessness statistics, something that's also moving ahead quite fast, but not the topic of today's conversation. With that, I will close. I will welcome anyone to be in touch in case you would like to find out more about that work. And with a particular focus on internal displacements, I would like to hand over the floor to our colleague from the Somalia, newly established or recently established National Statistical Bureau for Somalia, Mr. Shumaka Faha. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you very much, Bjorn. And first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers, the Joint Data Center of Forced Displacement, JDC of the World Bank, and the Expert Group on Refugee and Internally Displaced Persons Statistics, EGRIS of UNHCR, for this timely discussion on IDB and official statistics. First of all, I will say a little bit about about the Somali National Bureau of Statistics, and then I will go into generally aid data and our aims and objectives and drive of recent efforts in that direction. And then I will go on to speak about IDB statistics and the situation in Somalia, and then also about this recent effort by EGRIS and on this topic. So, Somali National Bureau of Statistics has been actually established in 2020, but Somalia has, since independence, always had a Department of Statistics that was embedded within the Ministry of Planning since 1960. But this was upgraded to a directorate in 2014. And at that time, the work of this new law that established the independent bureau that's in line with international standards was started. And the law came into effect in 2020, and in 2020, the director and deputy director were appointed. So we took this opportunity to upgrade, or renew our energy to fill our statistical gaps, and and also improve, statistics in Somalia. And part of that effort took us basically to how can we use aid data to generate, official statistics? How can we use it to fill our statistical gaps? And that was one aim. The other aim was also the aid and humanitarian data. How can we bring it closer to decision makers? how can we make it, because recent research basically showed that when the official statistics is involved with there is a greater propensity of uptake among policymakers and decision makers in developing countries. So that was our aim, and fortunately, we've made a lot of traction in that regard. So recently, the Food Security and Nutrition Analysis Unit of FAO and the Somali Water and Land Management Information were transferred to the Somali National Bureau of Statistics. This will enable us to generate official statistics and bring about, the statistical methodology and rigor to humanitarian data. As part of this effort, we were also involved in IDP statistics, and we were working mainly with IOM and OCHA in this space. But allow me, first of all, to say a little bit about, IDP situation in Somalia. Somalia has been in a protracted conflict and is now in a conflict stage, and really endeavoring to reconstruct and redevelop as much as it can. But there's been over the last 30 years there were many IDPs as a result of conflict, but lately of mainly again of drought. So there's always the issue of old IDPs and new IDPs coming. But I think that's one of the issues that EGRIS has also been able to help us, define, in terms of vulnerability. And we have also all kind of issues, including, interactions with host communities and how they feel and, their vulnerabilities too. But with regards to IDP statistics, recently this year, the Somali National Bureau of Statistics has made, extensive engagement with UN OCHA and IOM on defining actually the number with them. So the number is now 2.9 officially, and this is the first time that the official statistics actually has been involved. So we participated in a UN OCHA organized Humanitarian Information Management Working Group dataset that produces, the IDP figure estimates. And we went through, extensive detail of how this data was, triangulated, detailed site assessment, the DSA that was conducted in 2020, camp coordination and camp management, CCCM, site verification assessments that were conducted in 2020, and also displacement tracking matrix, or DTM mobility tracking from 2020. So that's how generally we came to agree. But in the midst of, while doing this, from a statistical background, we had many questions about, the standards, and as Natalia was mentioning earlier, about the framework, about definitions, and about, the kind of indicators that were being used. And from this was actually quite a challenge for us. And we had a lot of questions because this is the first time we were involved in such exercise. So while we were doing this, I think we stumbled. I mean, in my view anyway, the work has been ongoing, but at the same time, I think EGRIS came on board, and really we were delighted to see that we have a common, goal here to establish IDPs, not just from humanitarian or operational data that is just used for treating or for humanitarian responses, but actually how can we bring this, so the goals of EGRIS of, bringing on board official statistical community in the production and publication of statistics on IDPs and refugees resonated to us. The creating, ownership is part of our, really effort and goals. And also, evidence and driven policy making and the collaboration among partners and the comparability that it will lead to eventually is one of our. So I believe we are the first country or one of the first few countries that have requested technical assistance from EGRIS and are very pleased to be engaged in really developing this sector with EGRIS. And with that, I would like to leave it there, and we'll wait for the Q&A and what it brings for us later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to you, Mr. Director. It's also eye-opening to hear directly from you in the midst of this issue, but also particularly a context with its own specific challenges, as you've described so articulately for us today. And thank you for kicking off the panel this afternoon. With interest to not take up too much time, and please encouraging people to add questions into the chat as the speakers present their initial presentations to us. I'd like to hand over to our second speaker, Ms. Elena Shevtsova from the State Statistics Service of the Ukraine. She is the Deputy Director for Administrative Directorate, and we look very much to hearing from you. If I could ask my colleague to put Elena's slides up. Thank you very much. Now the floor is yours, Elena.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for introducing me. Distinguished organizers, honorable speakers, dear attendees, it is my great pleasure and honor to be with you here today at such a remarkable and outstanding event of global importance, I would say. And thank you so much for this privilege to share Ukraine's experience of implementation of international recommendations on IDP statistics at this very session. That is very important, especially in the context of the Sustainable Development Agenda till 2030. Because to ensure the achievement of leaving no one behind principle, it is very important to pay special attention to vulnerable groups of people. And data is the main prerequisite and the backbone for following evidence-based decision-making. So to start with, I would like to answer the question why IRIS is important. I would like to draw your attention to 5 generalized criteria I managed to outline, and to emphasize that all of them are intermingled and interrelated with one another, as if flowing out of each other. So IRIS implementation enhances data-driven policies development that leads to the promotion of evidence-based decision-making. In its turn, it supports IDPs integration and measurement that leads to facilitation of durable solution for IDPs and fosters achievement of leaving no one behind principle enshrined in the 2030 agenda ultimately. Also, I would like to outline some maybe country-specific criteria that might be used here. For example, the scope of people concerned, as in case with Ukraine, we speak about 1,473,650 IDPs registered in the IDPs registry administered by the Ministry of Social Policy as of July 2021. Another country-specific criterion might be legal frameworks, for example. In Ukraine, we have the presidential decree on the Sustainable Development Goals of Ukraine till 2030 that outlines that Sustainable Development Agenda should permeate all programming documents. So in December 2020, the State Statistics Service of Ukraine, jointly with IOM Ukraine, hosted a webinar, International Recommendations and IDP Statistics in Ukraine, involving relevant state institutions, civil society, international organizations, representatives, as well as EGRIS Secretariat was also present. The webinar was held within the IOM project aimed at humanitarian assistance and early recovery of the conflict-affected communities in eastern Ukraine, funded by the Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugees and Immigration. So thus, it gave the space for setting a working group on IRIS implementation in Ukraine. It is worth mentioning that this IRIS working group serves as the coordination mechanism and the platform for analysis, exchange of information, joint design and development of the roadmap for implementation of IRIS in Ukraine. And the overall objective of this working group is to adapt IRIS to the Ukrainian context in a coherent, comprehensive, and nicely coordinated manner. That is why we decided to split our work into two phases, the analytical one and the proper development of the roadmap. So analytical phase will end up with the production, with the development of analytical product, IRIS and state of play in Ukraine. And the objective of this document is to compare the IRIS and the existing statistical practices in relation to IDP statistics in Ukraine in order to formulate specific recommendations as to ways forward for development of the roadmap for implementation of IRIS in Ukraine. And the second phase will be based on this analytical product, the development of the roadmap for IRIS implementation of Ukraine. It is also worth mentioning here that Ukrainian was among first languages IRIS was translated into with IAM support. Next, please. Another point that is worth outlining is three dimensions of membership of IRIS working group in Ukraine. As far as it is very important and essential not only to get on board all national stakeholders, but also to engage international and global level. In case with Ukraine, we have national level representation of governmental organizations and non-governmental organizations. Among governmental organizations, we have those main actors dealing with either official statistics or internal displacement phenomenon to these or that to a certain extent, so to say. So we have State Statistics Service of Ukraine, Ministry of Social Policy, Ministry for Integration, Secretariat of the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, Ministry for Development of Gramadas and Territories of Ukraine, National Social Services Service, State Migration Service of Ukraine, Pension Fund, and there are also two think tanks represented there, Works Ukraine and SADAS. Thinking about international level, as it is of paramount importance to have European experience on board as well as international sound expertise in this regard, IOM, UNHCR, Danish Refugee Council, Danish Demining Group, Council of Europe's Project Internal Displacement in Ukraine Building Solutions, and Statistics Norway. As far as this initiative goes from global level to national level, and it is very important and vital to have global expertise engaged, and we are very happy that we have EGRIS support in this regard. Afterwards, it is also, this is the two-way process, and having implemented certain practices, it is also very good to share them afterwards, vice versa, globally, from the lessons learned that might be used in future for some other stakeholders. Next, please. So speaking about the current stage of our work, we are now about to finalize the analytical product. This analytical product will encompass the following points. Definition of IDPs in IRIS and Ukrainian legislation, and it is worth mentioning here that the essence of the definition depicted in the recommendations is fully reflected in the Ukrainian legislation, namely in the law of Ukraine on ensuring rights and freedoms of internally displaced persons. Usual and habitual place of residence in the context of internal displacement, categories of IDPs in the recommendations in Ukraine, long-term solutions and key vulnerabilities related to displacement in recommendations in Ukraine, criteria for assessing IDPs integration, data sources in the recommendations in Ukraine, variables and tabulations, coordination in the recommendations and potential mechanism for Ukraine. It is worth mentioning here that the main data source is in Ukraine is administrative data source. And we have the IDPs registry that is administered by the Ministry of Social Policy. Next, please. And also there are certain project activities happening in our country that also contribute immensely and cover certain points of the contexts of IRIS. For example, there is Project IDPs Integration Support Initiative in Ukraine, implemented by Danish Refugee Council and Danish Demining Group, jointly with the Ministry for Reintegration of Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine, with financial support from USAID. And the main objective of this project is to facilitate evidence-based policy planning towards the integration of IDPs through comprehensive and participatory processes, including the design of indicators to measure IDP integration in Ukraine based on the best national and international practices. And among the key results within this project, we may outline that IDPs' local integration criteria and indicators, as well as implementation modalities for the state monitoring of the local integration of IDPs, have been produced and discussed with the key stakeholders and outlined in the concept paper or guidelines for the Ministry of Reintegration. Another project is the Council of Europe project, Internal Displacement in Ukraine Building Solutions, that foresees the component of extension of functional capacities of IDPs registry. Next, please. But the main point is learning lessons. So the main lessons learned I would like to share with you are the following. Engaging all stakeholders at the process of initiation. It is important to set a working group and to engage, to provide, ensure multi-level engagement during this work. It is crucial to work out the algorithm of work, providing synergy of efforts to make sure that all stakeholders are on board, that no overlapping is happening, and that strong coordination mechanism and mapping of activities is taking place. And of course, advocacy, as we started our activities from the webinar, and now when we finalize the analytical product, IRIS and State of Ukraine, we also plan to organize another webinar. It is very important to divide work into phases and to highlight the results during public events or webinars, because strategic approach is also very important. I thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to answering your questions, if any. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Olena, and thank you and your colleagues for the leadership in the IRIS group. You bring up a lot of points that I think we could spend this whole seminar discussing, including how do we define IDPs in different countries. But that's for another seminar. Now we're going to move from sort of the production and the management of data to the use of data. And for that, we will move to Colombia. Colombia has been an active participant in the EGRIS group. I think its representatives from the victims unit. But this time, we will have a different representative on the panel. And we'll have Lucas Gomez, who is the presidential envoy for the Colombian-Venezuela border since 2020. So Lucas is centrally placed within the Colombian government with who uses, and I think that's what he will speak to particularly today, what kind of data does he need to do his job and what is the quality of the data that he has. I also want to recognize before you start, Mr. Gomez, Colombia's incredible work on the 2030 agenda generally, and your deep involvement and promotion of the SDGs overall, and including the notion of leaving no one behind. So with that, over to you, and you have up to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Bjorn. Thank you to everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here today to talk, as you say, what we use the data for make better policies and for design better policies. And today I'm going to take some minutes to talk to you about what we are doing with the data for particularly for the migrants, Venezuelan migrants that we have here in Colombia. And it's very important to us to share with you the importance that the data has in this moment, in this particular moment. And as you will see, we are talking about this TPS, the temporary protected status that we adopt for regularization for migrants, Venezuelan migrants in our country. Next, please. So Colombia commitment with protecting migrants' human rights started in 2016, and that's very important. We're going to see in a moment a timeline for what we are doing with the migrants. But the most important here, the most important idea that we have here is this: is we will continue with this idea that the policy for migrants is a state policy and not only a governmental policy. So this policy will still remain in the time for at least 10 years. That's very important. And it's not only a national governmental policy, it's also a local policy that is very important. And the data from the territories to make better policies and for the design of policies is very important to us. So now we are implementing, as I said before, the temporary protection status for migrants, but for us, that is just the beginning. We call that the master key for social and economic inclusion, social and economic integration for migrants in our country. Next, please. So just for give you an idea, over 5.2 million people, Venezuelan people have fled Venezuela, and almost 35% of these people remain in Colombia. So it's very important that you have an idea that with Venezuela, we have more than 2,200 kilometers of border. And the idea that we are maybe two brother and sister nations, is very important and very strong in the history of the two countries. So for Colombia, our policy is based on this notion of fraternity, on this notion of brotherhood with the Venezuelan brother and sister. It's very important because we never we never believe and we never think to close our border. We never think in stop the migration. We always say that we have to receive them and move in the direction of integration and move in the direction that we believe, we are convinced that if we have the success with the integration of migrants, Venezuelan migrants in our country, we believe that we are going to be a better country, a better nation here. So that's very important because when we see the Venezuelan migratory crisis, we are talking now about the second one around the world. And in all the projections that we have with the United Nations, it's going to be the most important migratory crisis in the world. So that's very important because the host countries, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, we are now seeing what we can do for receive them and for integrate them. Next, please. So with this timeline, I'm going to be very quick, but it's very important to have this idea that the migratory flows that comes to Colombia, the most important starts at 2016. And we create at this moment something that we call, and it's very important for Organiser, for all the kind of organization and coordination, the not only the aids for the Venezuela, but in this notion of integrate them in the country. We create this interagency mixed migration influx group. And it's very important because because here we have all the attention for Venezuelans, but also for Colombian returnees. And it's very important to have this in mind, because when we talk about data, in the national strategy and in the national statistic office, we have this distinction between Colombian returnees and migrants, and it's very important to have this in mind, because it's going to give us an idea that what are our goals with the integration and with the migration here. Then we start with the regulatory policies in 2017 with something that we call the PEP, Special Permit of Permanence, and it's very important because it's the beginning for the TPS that we adopt in 2021, and with this notion of 10 years of permit for Venezuelans in our country. And two or three elements very important here is, first one, in 2019, we create with the Department of National Statistics, the DANE, a special group for create migration stats, and that's very important because it was the base for the projection for the temporary status for our TPS, and that's very significant, because the idea that when we take the decision for the TPS, we have already a strong statistics for on at least the projection of what the migrants needs, and how many are present in our country. And I think for everyone, the COVID-19 pandemic was very difficult to move in the direction of the policies that was designed before that. And when we start with the pandemic, we see, for example, a change of the flows with the returns of Venezuelans from Venezuela to Venezuela, and something that we need to understand with the data and all the challenges that we have now with the TPS, and it's I hope these post-pandemic times. Next, please. So where we are, what are our goals for 2021, and that's very important because, as I said before, the TPS is a 10-year process. We're going to give to the Venezuelan 10 years of regularity status in Colombia, but in this moment we start with something that we call the pre-registration process, a virtual pre-registration process, and our goal for 2021 was to have at least 800,000 Venezuelans in these 3 moments, with the pre-registration, the enrollment, with something of digital documentation and biometric receipt, and then the document that we want to give them. And if we see the next slide, please. These goals are, we have already attained these goals. With something that is very important for us is that we create some kind of confidence between the state, Colombian state, and the migrants, and that's very important. But when you see the pre-registration process today, we have more than 1.3 million of Venezuelans that believes in the process of regularization. And with something that's very important, and Bjorn said something that in the introduction, that with this RUMB is a social and economic survey for the migrants. So now we have the information of 1.3 million Venezuelans that we doesn't have in the past. And that's very important to have in mind, because today we can start to design better policies. We can start to design policies adapted to the condition of these Venezuelan people, of these migrants, with the host communities, with the Colombian. And I think that it's very, very, very grateful for us to have the information of that more 1 million people here in our territory. And we start this biometric registration enrollment that I said before, and we expect at the end of our government to have at least 1.8 million of Venezuelan people visible. And I think the word is very, very significant here, because these people, when they are in an irregular status, they are invisible for the policies, invisible for the authorities. And now with this vocation, with this idea to give them this protected status for 10 years, we're going to have them visible in our territories, visible in our policies, and visible for all the authorities and for the decision makers to take better and better adapted policies for them. Next, please. So just to give you an idea, and I'm very quick because I know that we don't have much more time, but something that's very important is, why do we need data? You know, is why? And this is our goals, sectorial goals that we have in health system or with the Ministry of Health, in the education system. It's very important because we are, we have this huge challenge to give them all the possibilities to social and economic integration. So we have to move, for example, in the affiliation to the social security system for the migrants. We have also continue to open our schools for migrants. And with that, with the data, we have all the tools to move in the direction of social and economic integration. I finish with the final next slide, and I finish with that. Of course, we have to better targeting strategies. It's our challenge. We have to move in that direction. Of course, with the data we are doing, we are moving in the direction of redefining of programs directed towards migrants and host communities. It's very important to us to have these two ideas, accurate the monitoring of services and goods for migrants population, and take better and more informed decisions, decisions based on evidence. That's very important to us. So I let here, and just to remind that Colombia is committed with this social and economic integration, inclusion for migrants. And we have also the experience with the IDPs. We are using the both and trying to use all the data to have better policies and better policy decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucas Gomez. This is music to our ears. You really answered the question of data for what so concretely, and I think you really made this come alive. Thank you so much. And I think you set the scene very nicely for our next speaker, Haishan Fu. Haishan is, I'm sure, no stranger to any of you. She's a true leader in the data space, in the data international statistical community, and she's a leader at the World Data Forum. And I think you might even been there too as part of the founders of this group. So we're delighted to have you, Haishan. You also sit on the management committee of the Joint Data Center. For full disclosure, we're delighted to have you on the panel, and the floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bjorn. And it's just wonderful to come in after our other panelists, because really those issues are only become alive and in the concrete country context. And it's really heartening to see what each of the three governments have been doing in this regard. But when it comes to the bank, we all know our mission is to eradicate poverty and promote shared prosperity. So in the same spirit of the 2030 agenda, to leave no one behind, it's clear one of our top priorities has to be to address the challenges faced by the most vulnerable among us, including forcibly displaced people. As our other panelists have stressed again and again, for far too long, refugees and internally displaced people are often invisible in the data we usually collect and use to inform critical policy decisions by the government. it's clear, statistically speaking, we're still facing some of the most fundamental issues in this regard, from harmonizing definitions to refining methodologies to making data accessible for more impactful use. The COVID-19 crisis has made it very clear that across the world, we need to really invest urgently in the right data infrastructure, in new innovative approaches, and more importantly, in adopting a data agenda focused on inclusion. I've said this before, these three I's, infrastructure, innovation, and inclusion, point the way to a stronger data future and better lives for us all, but most importantly, for the forcibly displaced people with durable solutions. So as part of this effort, our team, it's the World Bank's Development Data Group, is actively collaborating with other partners to improve data and analysis available to make better decisions in this regard. We're very happy to be part of the Joint Data Center. And under this partnership, we have been focusing on contributing to three activities: data production, improvement of survey methods and tools, and establishment of new international standards. Here, just a few highlights on what we're doing in each of the three areas. First, data collection, data production. As you know, as the pandemic was raging on and face-to-face data collection was becoming severely limited, it was really great to see that our living standards and measurement studies team sprung to action to help with the design and implementation of several rounds of high-frequency phone surveys on the impact of COVID-19. It is very important to note that many of these surveys have an explicit focus on inclusion, particularly for population groups that are historically difficult to capture in data collection, such as the forcibly displaced people. I'm really glad to acknowledge that some of these phone surveys have been actively supported by the Joint Data Center. And as in the case in Bangladesh, Burkina Faso, Chad, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Iraq, Kenya, Jordan, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda, those surveys were carried out in partnership with the respective national statistical offices. I saw one of the questions was asking about the role of NSOs. I think there's an increasing role for NSOs to play in this field, and also with other international partners such as World Food Program and other operational units at the bank. And it's really good to see that the results of those surveys have been made accessible to the public on the Joint Data Centers and World Bank's website to promote wider use for policy analysis. Just one quick example, in the case of Ethiopia, the high-frequency phone surveys focus on refugees. According to a joint report released last December, the survey result revealed that 27% of the refugee respondents in Ethiopia reported partial or total loss of household income. 32% of the few refugees that were working prior to the pandemic reported having lost their jobs. But very positively, we also see from the survey that refugee respondents reported that the government and the international community have been able to maintain their support to refugees throughout the pandemic. In fact, 1/3 of all refugee households were receiving more assistance than before the crisis began. So this is the kind of thing that we have done throughout the COVID pandemic to help collect better data, focusing predominantly on getting the right data about people who are forcibly displaced. And at the same time, we're also exploring how to use geospatial information to help fill some of the critical data gaps. But I think one thing we need to really keep in mind, this requires continuing effort collectively to ensure that refugees and IDPs are represented in not only census and surveys, but also in administrative systems, including in how we can adopt the digital IDs, as in the case of Colombia, to not only give the identity to those people, but also through the means to collect better data to help them access the right services and introduce the proper interventions. Second, in terms of improvement of survey methods and tools, this is really critical, given that the conventional means of data collection through surveys have its shortcomings when it comes to addressing the special need of people who are forcibly displaced. So in support of the UNHCR's new global survey program, our LSM surveys have developed draft questionnaire models for economic, social, and demographic survey data collections that is aligned with the UNHCR's priorities. And also, as you know, making forcibly displaced people more visible starts with improving sample frames and sampling approaches. So I'm really glad that in this regard, the UNHCR's administrative data, also known as progress, are essential for internally displaced people. New sampling tools and methods are needed, and with this administrative data system that help us to really target those people more effectively, and also have been able to use our own survey solutions approach to support this effort. Another area of our effort is really to help fill other data gaps so that we can have more targeted policy analysis. One of the example is how to address missing consumption data in the context of refugees. This is where our researchers have been helping to develop applied imputation method to obtain poverty estimates to better improve targeting approach. It's really great to see that more of such initiative could be introduced in the days to come. Just lastly, a few words on how to help establish new international standards and best practices. And as Natalie and other panelists have clearly indicated, we still need to focus on some of those basic questions in terms of definition, standards, and so on and so forth. And this is where we're very happy. We're part of the EGRIS process to help help to refine our standard approach and support capacity development in countries to implement new approaches to improve our data collection. So I really don't want to say too much more. I just want to stress how important it is for us to continue to build on these initiatives and partnerships so we can really move steadily towards our goal of meeting the demand for reliable, comparable, and timely data to enhance decision-making, policymakers, to improve lives of people who are forcibly displaced. We really need to work together to make these people visible, therefore to make their life count. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Haishan, and to all of our distinguished speakers today. We have very limited time, and I know everyone is rushing off to the next meeting. So I would like to just say two quick suggestions around the Q&A that Bjorn and I have just discussed. Firstly, please, to the panelists, there are some questions that have been directed at individual panelists, me included. And I would like to ask us all just to take the time to answer directly in the chat, which can happen after the time has ended. The questions that are directly addressed to you, for example, Elena and Lucas, I see a few for yourselves and from me as well. I wanted to pick up on two questions that have been voted on a few times. Pose those to the whole panel and then ask each panelist to just say maybe if you want to a closing remark or response to one of these questions. So there was a couple of questions and then we'll hand over to Bjorn for a final closing word. There were a few questions around the impact of the pandemic and how has COVID impacted the collection of data on refugees and IDPs. And there were also a couple of questions differently phrased, but around the role of CSOs, so civil society organizations, in the production of data on refugees and IDPs. So I'd like to draw the panel's attention to those two questions and hand over in order of, in the original order again, to see if you would like to respond and or say a brief closing remark from each of you. So Mr. Shimonkefara, please no more than 1 minute each. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. On the first one on COVID has affected us, and so I'm glad Haishan actually mentioned the high-frequency phone survey. So that's what we have been doing in place of places that, the in effect of the COVID, but also is being useful for additional challenge that we have, which is lack of access to certain areas because of security. So GIS also is another method that we are employing to ensure or triangulate the data. So those are two things. The other question on civil society organizations, I think, the UN, especially IOM and others, do engage NGOs in the collection of the IDB data. But how productive that is actually debatable in my view, because even though you don't really need to have a license to practice statistics, you really do need to have understanding of standards and definitions and to be using a standard framework. So that's my 2 cents on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, Olena, and only if you want to.
Thank you, Natalia. I will be also very brief. Concerning the pandemic, it seems to me that pandemic influenced everybody undescribably and immensely, and but within these difficult times, given circumstances, we should try to find the opportunities behind all of this and to improve the modus operandi, but for problematic areas, somehow all those problems we face, the moment we are strong enough to overcome them, we find new methods, new approaches, and something new that might be very useful. And speaking about the second question concerning civil society engagement, as I have already mentioned in my presentation, we included civil society opinion into the initiation phase of our work in terms of roadmap development. And they are with us while drafting, while analyzing, making their inputs. We are working very closely with civil society, as it should be in terms of following modern criteria of public policy decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if we have lost our online audience, but I think we have through the WOVA platform. So I'm going to suggest actually to our following two speakers that we stop there and we ask Bjorn to close. And of course, encourage anyone to continue in the chat, which stays open for longer. Sorry about running over for a few minutes. Bjorn, over to you.
Okay, well, very quickly then, and maybe to pick up on, I think, what our colleague from Colombia would have said, let's keep in mind one of the big takeaways today is data for what? And let's always keep an eye on, is the data that we're collecting and that we're managing, how can we make it as operationally relevant as possible? And when I say that, I mean that in a very broad sense, both for policymakers, but also for practitioners, those who program aid money, development funds, or national resources. A big message here on inclusion, of course. I didn't hear all that much about statistical capacity building, but I know that's at the core for many countries, I'm sure, including in Somalia. Having the ability to collect this data is no small feat, and we need to lend as much support as asked for. The importance of definitions and standards. And we also heard voices on comparability of data between different communities, between those who are IDPs, refugees, host communities, and national averages. So with those few words of summarizing a very rich discussion, I want to thank all the participants, and also I really want to thank the teams on both the EGRIS side and on the JDC side for all the work for pulling this together, pulling it off. And finally, the biggest thanks to you panelists for making the time, for setting aside and for sharing your insights. And of course, thank you to my co-facilitator, Natalia. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of World Data Forum.
Goodbye.